When a raging storm slammed into the countryside that night, no one imagined a single farmer would risk everything to save a total stranger and his young son. But that's exactly what happened. Picture the frantic rush of floodwaters pulling a car off the road in Henry Hank Foster, nearly 70 years old, diving in without a second thought to pull a father and child from the brink of disaster. This incredible rescue set off a chain of events that would change Hank's life and his family farm forever. If you want to find out how one selfless act led to a fresh start filled with new hope, be sure to watch or listen to the entire story. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you'll never miss the inspiring tales we share each week. Henry Hank Foster was 68 years old and had seen his fair share of storms, both literal and metaphorical. Yet nothing in his life had ever loomed quite as large as the troubles that now threatened the family farm he'd tended for over 5 decades. He was born and raised on this spread of land in southern Georgia, a place of gently sloping pastures and sturdy oak trees that he still thought of as home even after the world around him changed 100 times over. There had been a Foster living on this farm since 1929, and Hank had taken the reins after his father passed away from a heart ailment. For decades, Hank toiled under the scorching sun, coaxing tomatoes, okra, and squash from the reluctant soil during long summers and coddling rows of collard greens through mild winters. But the last few years had tested him in ways he never expected. Rising costs, falling crop prices, and a series of unpredictable weather events had chipped away at his financial stability. Then the bank notices started coming. The words foreclosure and final warning weighed on him like lead whenever he opened his mailbox. He wanted to believe that one more good season could save him, just as he believed that if he woke before dawn and worked until his back ached, he'd somehow eke out enough to pay the mortgage. Yet time was not on his side. His wife, Laura, had passed away a year prior after a sudden stroke, leaving Hank alone in the old farmhouse they'd shared for nearly 4 decades. Without her laughter and calm wisdom, every corner of the house echoed a little differently, and the fields he used to work with her gentle encouragement now felt haunted by her absence. Their children lived hours away in cities, one in Atlanta, one in Nashville, and though they visited when they could, they had families of their own. Hank, stubborn as a Georgia mule, had refused their offers of money. Pride was something he carried, a trait he couldn't just set aside, even in the face of mounting debt. He did have one companion, though Buddy, an energetic golden retriever mix who'd attached himself to Hank after being found abandoned on the farm's edge a few years back. Buddy had a knack for sensing Hank's moods, laying his head on Hank's knee whenever the farmer sat at the kitchen table, staring at spreadsheets or loan statements, trying to make sense of numbers that refused to add up. Day by day, the pressure intensified. Hank put on a brave face, but at 68, his bones ached more than they used to. Some mornings, it was a monumental effort just to swing his legs off the bed and force himself to feed the chickens. On that particular May evening, the sky had an ominous pall. The meteorologists on the scratchy radio said there was a tropical depression pushing inland, promising torrential rains that might last through the week. Hank tried to shrug it off. Storms came and went. After all, what worried him more was the final notice he'd received from the bank that very morning. He needed a significant payment by the end of the month, or they would begin the foreclosure process. There was a slim chance he could salvage enough produce from the fields to sell at the market in town if the crops didn't get ruined by the downpour. Sitting on his front porch with the sagging wooden steps, Hank sipped bitter black coffee as he watched the wind begin to stir the tops of the oaks. Buddy sat at his feet, ears perked, gaze set on the rolling thunderheads in the distance. Hank's heart was heavier than any cloud overhead, and as the first droplets spattered against the porch roof, he sighed deeply. He thought about Laura, about all the times she'd told him to be open-minded about change, and he silently prayed that maybe the coming storm would spare him, if only for one season. The rain began quietly, enough soft sheets that patted against the soil and darkened the dusty ground. By midnight, though, a howling wind had kicked up, shaking the windows of Hank's farmhouse. He'd spread buckets around to catch leaks from his aging roof, but the drips still fell intermittently, creating a discordant percussion that echoed through the silent house. With Buddy huddled at his side, Hank dozed fitfully on an old recliner in the living room. A flashlight and battery-powered radio on the coffee table. Static-laden updates warned of flash floods in low-lying areas. Hank worried about the small creek on the western boundary of his property, which occasionally overflowed in heavy rains. If it crested, it could flood the southwestern field, where his best tomatoes grew. Already, he feared for the battered tractor that was on its last legs. Close to 2 in the morning, a particularly loud crack of thunder jolted him upright. Buddy barked, a quick warning, then fell silent. Hank rubbed his eyes and flicked on the radio. The local weatherman's voice crackled through severe weather alert. Roads are washing out in some areas. Stay off the highways if you can. Hank shook his head. He'd survived hurricanes in this old house, but never had he felt quite so uneasy. Perhaps it was the knowledge that he had no cushion left, no resources to rebuild if this storm took his remaining crops. If he lost them now, he wouldn't just be dealing with a setback. It would mean the end of an 80-year family legacy. He tried to snatch a few moments of restless sleep again, but the thunder rattled his nerves. Eventually, he gave up and tugged on his tall boots and rain jacket. He aimed to inspect the fields by flashlight. Maybe if the drainage ditches needed clearing, he could still save something. Buddy, loyal as ever, followed him out onto the porch, where the wind whipped sheets of water sideways, soaking Hank's pants in seconds. Bolts of lightning revealed ghostly silhouettes of the oaks, their branches thrashing. Carefully descending the slick steps, Hank made his way toward the southwestern field, the beam of his flashlight bobbing in the darkness. The water was already ankle-deep in some spots, swirling around the edges of the rows where tomatoes struggled against the onslaught. He cursed under his breath, trudging to the drainage ditch. But the current there was too strong, more like a small river than a ditch. From every direction, the storm hammered the land. Hank tried to clear debris that had clogged the channel, but each time he tossed a branch aside, 3 more sticks, leaves, and mud rushed in. Buddy barked anxiously nearby. Hank recognized the futility. The rain was coming faster than he could bail it away. Defeated, he sloshed back toward the farmhouse, cursing the weather, cursing the bank, cursing his own aging bones. That was when he caught a flicker of headlights beyond the edge of his property. Normally, the county road was empty at this hour, especially in a storm. But a sudden flash of lightning illuminated the horizon, and he saw a pair of headlights sink lower, almost as if the vehicle had dipped off the road. Then he heard a faint but distinct blaring of a car horn. It cut through the roar of the rain, a rhythmic blast that could only mean trouble. Hank hesitated. The road was a good quarter-mile away, across muddy ground and near that creek he worried about. It would be foolish to head there now, but the horn persisted. If someone was stuck or hurt, the time to act was immediate. Mind made up. Hank whistled for Buddy and started marching toward the sound, determined to help whoever it was, come hell or high water. The wind-driven rain felt like needles on Hank's exposed face as he pushed through the muddy field. Buddy bounded ahead, his wet fur plastered to his body, pausing periodically to look back as if to urge Hank onward. Each time lightning lit the sky. Hank caught a glimpse of the battered fence line that separated his property from the county road. He was already knee-deep in water in some spots, the ground beneath him turning to slick clay. Each footstep threatened to yank his boots clean off. But still, he pressed forward, thinking of how Laura would never forgive him if he turned his back on someone in danger. He reached the fence and hoisted himself over it, sliding into the water on the other side. The horn had stopped, which worried him. Either the battery had died or the driver had given up. Using the flashlight, Hank scanned the darkness until he saw the outline of a large SUV resting at a precarious angle in a flooded ditch. The front tires were submerged, and the current around the vehicle looked strong. He waded closer, feeling the cold water rise toward his waist. He wasn't a young man anymore, and each step sapped a bit more of his energy. But he called out, "Hey, anyone there?" No immediate response. Hank reached the driver's side door and peered in. The window was fogged with condensation, but he thought he saw movement. He rapped on the glass with the flashlight. A moment later, it cracked open just enough to let the storm in. "Help!" came a man's shaky voice from inside. Hank immediately noticed the blood trickling down the man's forehead. In the back seat was a child of maybe 7 or 8, eyes wide with terror, hugging a stuffed animal. I can't get the door open," the man gasped, voice trembling. "It's jammed, and the water is rising." Hank yanked on the handle but found it stuck. The angle of the SUV, half submerged, had jammed the door against the ground. "Roll the window down all the way," Hank shouted over the wind. The man nodded, fumbling with the switch. As the window slid down, a fresh wave of rain and floodwater sloshed inside. Hank tossed his flashlight aside. It was little use in these conditions anyway, and reached through the open window. "First, hand me the kid," he urged. "We gotta get him out of here now." The man, obviously disoriented, struggled to unbuckle his son. The boy sobbed, clinging to the stuffed animal as he was passed through the window. Hank held the child carefully, mindful of his own footing, feeling the tug of the current against his legs. "Buddy," he called to the dog, who splashed around near the tailgate. "Go on, boy, back up the bank." Buddy barked and headed toward the higher ground. Hank maneuvered the child so that his arms wrapped around Hank's neck. "You just hold on tight," he said gently. "I've got you." It was the father's turn next. Hank reached in again. "Come on," he urged. "We need to move fast." The man tried to pull himself up, but the door frame was slick. He managed to wedge himself halfway out when a swirl of water rocked the SUV, nearly ripping him from Hank's grasp, summoning strength he didn't know he still had. Hank braced his back against the vehicle and heaved. The father tumbled out, splashing into Hank's side. Together, they staggered to keep balance. The child pressed between them. Then, with Hank supporting both father and son, they began the perilous journey back up the flooded ditch. Thunder rumbled like artillery overhead, and lightning revealed how truly treacherous the water was. It was a churn of mud, debris, and broken branches. Hank felt something hard ram against his shin, but he clenched his teeth and kept going. If they stayed there much longer, the SUV might shift again, or worse, the entire ditch could surge. He couldn't allow that to happen. They had to get to higher ground fast. Boom. Step by agonizing step, Hank led them away from the sinking SUV. The boy clung to Hank's shoulders, crying softly in fear and cold. The father winced with each footstep, favoring his left leg, which seemed injured. Rain pelted them, and the wind threatened to topple the trio with each gust. Buddy stood near the fence line, barking encouragement as if to say, "This way." Hank offered a quick prayer of thanks for the dog, whose presence felt like a lifeline in a dark sea of chaos. Finally, they reached the fence, and Hank pushed the boy up and over. Then, using what remained of his strength, he helped the father climb. By the time Hank himself scrambled over, his breath was ragged, and his heart pounded like a war drum. They stood for a moment, panting in the dark, until Hank realized they couldn't stay out in this storm. The old farmhouse was at least a quarter-mile away, but it was on slightly higher ground. "We need to get inside," he told the father. "My place isn't much, but it's dry." The man nodded, clearly grateful but too shocked to speak. With one arm around the father's waist to support him, and the boy held close, Hank trudged through the field, Buddy leading the way. Each flash of lightning illuminated a landscape transformed rows of crops half submerged, water pooling in every depression, the once firm earth dissolving into muck. Hank felt a pang in his chest seeing the damage to the land he cherished. But that was a matter for tomorrow. Right now, people's lives were at stake. By the time they reached the farmhouse, Hank's limbs felt like lead. He pushed open the door and ushered them into the living room. It was dark except for the sporadic glow of lightning through the windows. Grabbing his lantern from the coffee table, Hank turned its knob, and a wavering golden light filled the space. "Here," he said, guiding father and son to the worn-out couch. "Sit down. Catch your breath. Let me see what I can do about that cut on your head." The father, still panting, nodded. He cradled his son, who trembled with cold and shock. Hank rushed to fetch towels from a closet. Returning to wrap them around the pair, Buddy shook water off his fur, trotting in small circles as though anxious to help. Once Hank got the father's bleeding under control with some gauze and antiseptic, he looked at the boy. "What's your name?" son Hank asked gently. "Nathan," the child stammered, hugging his stuffed dinosaur with trembling arms. He seemed too scared to even wipe away the tears streaming down his cheeks. "Well, Nathan," said Hank, forcing a reassuring smile. "I'm Hank Foster, and this here is my dog, Buddy. You're safe now." The father finally managed to speak, murmuring his own name as Victor Tan. He tried to stand but winced, nearly dropping back onto the couch. His ankle looked swollen, possibly sprained or broken. Hank felt a surge of sympathy. This man had nearly died out there, and now he was stranded in a stranger's home. "Mr. Foster?" Victor began, voice unsteady. "I don't know how to thank you. If you hadn't come when you did—" His words caught in his throat. Nathan clung closer, and the father gently stroked the child's hair, offering what comfort he could. Hank waved off the gratitude. "We'll worry about thanks later," he said. "Right now, we got a storm to wait out. There's no telling how bad it'll get by morning." Though he spoke calmly, inside he felt a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, relief at saving them, fear for his land, and the unshakable sense that everything about his life was on the brink of irreversible change. Lightning continued to flicker outside the farmhouse windows, throwing skewed shadows across the living room floor. Hank set out a few candles, then moved to the kitchen, calling over his shoulder, "I'll brew some coffee. That might help warm us up." He paused to light the old gas stove top. The power had flickered out earlier, so he had to rely on his hurricane lamps, a stash of which he kept in case of emergencies. Since Laura's passing, these storms felt lonelier, the house emptier. Yet, strangely, the presence of these two strangers made the house come alive again, a sense of urgency and compassion overshadowing the quiet gloom that had settled since his wife's death. Buddy followed Hank into the kitchen, tail swishing through puddles on the floor left by their drenched clothing. Hank couldn't help but notice how soaked his own clothes were. He stripped off his rain jacket, draping it over a chair. When the coffee started percolating, he returned to the living room and handed Victor a warm blanket. "You should get out of those wet clothes if you can," Hank suggested. "I'll lend you something of mine. It'll be big, but at least it's dry." Victor nodded, wincing as he shifted his swollen ankle. He was in his mid-30s, Hank guessed, with sharp but kind features, an angular jaw, neatly trimmed hair, and a careful, deliberate way of speaking. Meanwhile, Nathan had calmed down a bit, though he still clutched his dinosaur toy and watched Hank with cautious eyes. Hank knelt down. "Let's check your father's ankle," he told the boy, as though inviting him to help. The child nodded, inching closer but keeping one hand on that dinosaur. Gently, Hank peeled back Victor's soaked shoe and sock. The ankle was badly bruised, already showing dark splotches and swelling. "Might not be broken, but it's a heck of a sprain," Hank muttered. "I can wrap it, at least." He shuffled to a closet, retrieved an elastic bandage. As he bandaged Victor's ankle, the father hissed in pain but offered a tight smile of thanks. Hank recalled the days he'd learned first aid in the Army Reserves. Back in his youth, some lessons never went stale. Soon, the aroma of coffee drifted from the kitchen, and Buddy padded over to inspect the pot with a hopeful wag of his tail. Hank poured 3 cups, one with a bit of sugar for Nathan, to help calm the boy's nerves if he was allowed to have it. Setting the cups on the living room table, he said, "It's not gourmet, but it'll warm you up. Just be careful it's hot." Nathan sipped tentatively, then relaxed a fraction. Victor rubbed the boy's back, giving Hank a grateful nod. It was a stark image, a young father and child huddled in the living room of a near stranger, while outside, thunder shook the sky. Hank felt a blend of responsibility and paternal protectiveness. Though he was no longer sure what tomorrow would bring, the farmland could be underwater by dawn, and he'd still have to face the bank soon. But in that moment, none of that mattered as much as making sure Victor and Nathan were safe. After the coffee took the chill out of their bones, Hank propped up Victor's foot on a cushion. Best to keep weight off that ankle, he advised. I've got an old guest room down the hall. It's dusty, but you can sleep there tonight. Tomorrow, if the storm eases, we'll figure out how to get you home or to a hospital, if need be. Victor exhaled, relief washing over him. Nathan, however, suddenly looked stricken with a new worry. Dad, he whispered, nodding at the window, where the wind still blew fiercely. What if the water gets higher? Hank walked to the window, peering into the blackness outside. We're on a bit of a hill here, son, he reassured. We'll be all right. Promise, child. The hours passed in a haze of thunderclaps and flickering lantern light. Hank left the father and son to rest on the couch. While he rummaged through the closets for extra bedding and clothes, he found a pair of old flannel pajamas of his father's that might fit Victor, or at least be passable for the night. For Nathan, he found a large t-shirt that might function as a nightshirt until morning. A wave of melancholy came over him when he realized how little the guest room had changed since Laura's funeral. The blankets were still folded the way she liked, and her knitting bag was in the corner. Half-finished scarf still draped from the side. Life had paused in certain corners of this house, waiting for her to come back. Taking a breath, Hank returned to the living room. Victor, pale but slightly more composed, thanked Hank for the pajamas, then carefully hobbled to the bathroom to change. Hank knelt by Nathan, offering the t-shirt. The boy was initially shy, but something in Hank's kind eyes and gentle voice must have reassured him. Okay, Nathan finally said, hugging his dinosaur. Thank you, Mr. Foster. Hank nodded, ruffling the boy's damp hair. Hank is fine, he replied. Once they'd changed, Hank guided them to the guest room down the hall. There's an old nightlight in there, he said, hooking a thumb toward an electric lantern he had set on the dresser. I don't know if you like to sleep in the dark or not, but it'll help you see if you need to get up during the night. Nathan nodded, eyes big. We're okay, right? He asked softly. Hank squatted down, meeting the boy's gaze. You're okay, he repeated, a gentle firmness in his tone that brokered no argument. Storm can't last forever. He closed the door partway, leaving them to rest, then wandered back into the living room. Buddy trotted alongside him, tail down. Sensing Hank's heaviness of spirit, Hank stroked the dog's ears, letting out a slow exhale. He turned on the battery-powered radio again, hoping to catch the latest weather advisory. A muffled voice reported that the storm was still raging and had triggered flash floods in multiple counties. Power outages were widespread, and roads were impassable. It might be another 12 to 24 hours before the floodwaters receded. Hank switched it off. The last thing Victor and Nathan needed was more bad news. In the quiet that followed, Hank felt every inch of his age. The adrenaline from the rescue was wearing off, and his muscles ached in protest. He wasn't the spry soldier he'd been decades ago, but he felt a warmth in his chest, a sense of purpose that had been missing since Laura passed. He'd been drowning in whirl about the bank and the farm, all the while forgetting the simple virtues that had kept him grounded: kindness, community, helping those in need. Sinking into his recliner, he propped his feet up and let his eyes close. Buddy settled next to him. Outside, the storm bellowed, but inside, at least for now, there was shelter, warmth, and a faint hope that morning might bring a clearer path. Dawn arrived slow and gray, the sky washed in pewter clouds that still sputtered drizzle. The pounding of the storm had waned to a mere patter of rain, though the swollen streams and ditches were yet to retreat. Hank woke to Buddy nudging his arm, then saw, through half-lidded eyes, the living room clock's hands pointing to nearly 7. He heaved himself upright, wincing at the stiffness in his back and shoulders. Across the hallway, he heard low voices. Victor and Nathan must be awake. He tapped lightly on the guest room door. "Mornin'," he said, pushing it open. Nathan was perched on the bed, hugging the dinosaur, while Victor sat, leg outstretched, bandaged ankle propped on a pillow. Both wore worried expressions. Hank offered a small, reassuring smile. "Storm's let up some," he said, "but it's still wet out there." Let me check around outside, see what we're dealing with. Then we'll figure out how to get you folks home." The father and son both nodded. Nathan quietly asked, "Is the car?" Hank's chest tightened. That SUV had seemed on the verge of being swept away last night. It might still be there. He lied kindly. "I'll let you know what I find." Turning away, he went to gather his boots and an old oilskin jacket. Buddy followed at his heels as he stepped onto the porch, blinking at the drizzly morning. Outside, the world looked battered. Fallen branches littered the yard, and the fields were dotted with massive puddles, small lakes. Really? A dull ache of despair welled in Hank's gut when he saw how waterlogged everything was. If those tomatoes and peppers hadn't drowned yet, they were certainly close to it. But he forced himself to keep going, forging a path toward the western boundary. He skirted the standing water, careful not to lose his footing in the mud. The sky hung low, still threatening, though the thunder had moved on. When he reached the ditch, his heart sank. The SUV was nowhere to be seen. The muddy current had likely claimed it. Hank closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of that realization settle. He thought about what it must mean for Victor losing a vehicle. Quite possibly valuable personal items inside. At least father and son were safe. Hank took a breath and turned back, deciding to check the southwestern field. That chore did nothing to improve his spirits. Many of the plants were flattened or uprooted entirely. Rivers of runoff had cut gullies through the farmland, carrying topsoil away by the ton. Hank tried to gauge if any portion of the crop could still be salvaged, but the devastation looked total in the lower sections. Buddy whined softly at his side, sensing Hank's distress. "We'll figure something out," Hank mumbled, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince, the dog or himself. Sloshing back toward the farmhouse, he pictured the sympathetic but unwavering face of the bank manager. He recalled how the last phone call had ended with the words, "Final extension." Another wave of fatigue crashed over him. All that talk of hope last night, all the simple virtue of helping others, now felt overshadowed by the grim reality that his livelihood might be beyond saving. Yet, as he neared the porch, he spotted movement behind the screen door. Nathan stood there, face pressed to the mesh, watching him anxiously. Hank mustered a smile. He couldn't show this boy the burden of his despair. He and his father had already lost enough. Taking a steadying breath, Hank climbed the steps and said through the screen, "Well, the storm did a number on us, but we'll manage. Let's get you both something to eat." If there was one thing that always helped in hard times, it was a warm meal. Hank might not have much left, but he had enough to fill a couple of plates for his unexpected guests. The kitchen felt cozier than usual that morning, the hiss of the gas stove and the subtle warmth of the lantern creating a haven from the drenched world outside. Hank rummaged through his limited pantry to see what he could whip up. He found a package of oatmeal, a half dozen eggs, and a bit of bread that hadn't gone stale yet. It wasn't a feast, but it would do. Nathan lingered in the doorway, clutching his dinosaur, occasionally glancing at Buddy, who wagged his tail encouragingly at the boy. Meanwhile, Victor hobbled in on his wrapped ankle, leaning against the doorframe. "Let me help," he offered. "I'm not much in the kitchen, but I can at least crack eggs." Hank shook his head but smiled. "You just sit. That ankle won't heal if you're standing on it." Reluctantly, Victor eased himself onto a wooden chair. Nathan settled next to him, eyes wide with curiosity as Hank poured oatmeal into an old metal pot. "My mother used to say oatmeal cures all ills," Hank said, stirring the pot. "Don't know if that's true, but it's filling." Victor made a soft, rueful sound. "I'm just grateful we're not out in the storm." He glanced at Nathan. "We were on our way to a family place further south, a bit of a vacation." His voice dropped. "Guess we took a wrong turn on a back road. The GPS told me to go one way, and I should have known better." Hank heard the guilt in Victor's tone and saw it reflected in the father's worried gaze at his son. Soon enough, Hank ladled oatmeal into bowls. He fried up the eggs in a bit of oil, tossing in a pinch of salt. The small act of cooking steadied him, reminding him of simpler routines. "Eat up," he urged, placing the bowls before them and handing Nathan a spoon. The boy timidly dipped his spoon into the oatmeal, testing it. His face brightened, whether from hunger or taste. Hank wasn't sure. As they ate, Hank hesitated, then decided they deserved to know the fate of the SUV. He told them what he saw, that the water had likely swept it away. Nathan looked stricken. Apparently, he had some cherished toys in the back seat. Victor set down his spoon, pressed his lips together. "So it's gone." Hank nodded. "I'm sorry." Victor exhaled. "Better the car than us." He put a hand on Nathan's shoulder. "We'll figure something out." After breakfast, Hank cleared the dishes, letting father and son rest. It was mid-morning by then, and the rain had dwindled to a drizzle. Buddy barked at the windows, as though eager for a chance to explore. Hank was about to volunteer to see if any phone lines still worked when, to everyone's surprise, a brief glow sparked on the living room ceiling light. Power was flickering back. Albeit intermittently, Victor pulled out his phone with a pained grimace. But as expected, there was no signal. "I guess the towers are down," he said with a defeated shrug. A silence settled, broken only by the drip-drip of water still clinging to the eaves. Hank folded his arms. "Look, if the roads are impassable, you might be here a while. I'm not sure how soon the floodwaters will recede." He paused, wrestling with his own sense of hospitality versus practicality. Times were tough, money was tight, but how could he turn them away? "I've got enough supplies to last a bit. You're welcome to stay until we can get you out safely." The words sounded final, and Victor nodded, his gratitude unspoken but evident in his eyes. Nathan looked around the farmhouse's modest but welcoming interior, as though slowly processing that this would be their refuge for at least another day or two. And outside, the farm fields bore silent witness, their furrows drowned, waiting for the next shift in weather or fortune. By midday, the clouds began to lift in patches, revealing a wan sun. Hank decided it was time to take stock of the farm's damage, and Victor asked if he could accompany him, eager to get a sense of his surroundings. Though concerned about Victor's ankle, Hank acknowledged that an extra set of eyes might help. So, with Buddy leading the way and Nathan trailing close behind, the four set out carefully across the soggy farmstead. The southwestern field, once lush with rows of tomatoes and peppers, now lay in disarray. Large patches of mud had replaced the neatly tended rows, torn plants jutted from the muck at odd angles, and debris leaves, branches, even a piece of someone's torn-off gutter littered the space. Hank knelt, scooping up a handful of the muddy soil. "This topsoil's gone for sure," he said, voice thick with resignation. "Took me years to build it up. Now it's half washed away." Victor surveyed the damage, brow furrowed. "Insurance doesn't cover crop loss." Hank let the mud slip from his fingers. "Not for flooding of this scale. Not out here. Couldn't afford those premiums." He tried to keep his tone level, but bitterness crept in. Years of effort undone in one night. Nathan stood to the side, eyes filled with sympathy he might not fully understand. Meanwhile, Buddy sniffed at a broken irrigation pipe that jutted from the ground like a snapped bone. They moved on to the chicken coop near the barn. Thankfully, Hank's 3 remaining hens had survived, clustered on a raised roost. He tossed them a handful of feed, murmuring a quiet reassurance. Then they continued to the tractor shed, where Hank discovered his old tractor waterlogged and half submerged in a mire of silt. "Damn," he muttered, checking the undercarriage. "That's probably shot. Could cost more to fix it than it's worth." All the while, Victor limped alongside, occasionally offering a supportive word. At one point, he paused, leaning on his makeshift crutch, a stout branch, and stared across the fields. "You said your family's farmed here for generations." Hank nodded, brushing damp hair from his forehead. "My grandfather bought this place in '29, just in time for the Great Depression. Somehow, he and my grandmother held on, made it through, and passed it on to my father. Then it came to me." Victor glanced at Nathan, as if imagining a lineage. "You've put your heart and soul into this land." Hank swallowed. "That's an understatement." They circled back around toward the farmhouse, the horizon a patchwork of black mud and standing water. Along the way, Victor asked questions about the farm's acreage, the types of crops, How Hank watered them? Hank explained the old-fashioned irrigation lines, the rotating schedules. Each question felt like a gentle probe, as if Victor was gathering data. Hank wondered if Victor was some sort of agricultural consultant. But that idea seemed off. He'd mentioned a family place they were traveling to. Maybe he was just curious. When they arrived back at the porch, Nathan hurried ahead to open the door. Hank lingered, letting Victor rest on the steps for a moment. The father gazed out over the battered fields. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, voice tight. "You saved us, and it feels like all I can do is watch your own life's work get swept away." Hank sighed, bracing himself on the porch railing. "It was going to happen whether I helped you or not," he replied, choosing honesty. Might as well do the right thing. That was the truth. Saving 2 lives mattered far more than a field of tomatoes. But as he glanced at the horizon again, the weight of that sacrifice pressed against his chest. One single, selfless act wouldn't make the bank any kinder, and the storm had no notion of fairness. That evening, Hank tried to busy himself with chores around the house, cleaning the silt off the porch, checking the generator for any chance it might run again. The power had come back intermittently, only to disappear an hour later. He was scraping mud from a shovel when Buddy started barking frantically at the front driveway. Hank straightened, curious. The roar of a vehicle engine approached unusual, given the roads were supposedly impassable. Shielding his eyes, Hank peered through the dusk and saw a large, black SUV rolling slowly toward the farmhouse. Not the same one from last night, obviously, but a new arrival. Victor emerged from the house, limping slightly, his expression tense. Nathan followed, wide-eyed. The SUV stopped about 20 yards away, and 2 men in dark jackets stepped out, scanning the area as if they were security. Hank's pulse quickened. This looked serious. Then another figure exited the back seat, a woman in a trim suit. She strode up the muddy path, picking her steps carefully, and called out, "Mr. Tan, we've been trying to reach you." Victor's shoulders sagged in relief. "That's my assistant, Alicia," he said to Hank. Hank frowned, uncertain. Assistant. So this man was important enough to warrant personal staff. Alicia hurried forward, her professional demeanor contrasting sharply with the rural chaos. "Sir, we lost contact when you didn't arrive at the hotel," she explained, glancing anxiously at Nathan. "We contacted authorities, but the flooding." Her voice cracked with genuine concern. Victor rested a hand gently on her shoulder. "We're okay, thanks to Mr. Foster here." Hank offered a stiff nod, still unsure how to act. Alicia turned to Hank, eyes bright with gratitude. "Thank you for keeping them safe. We can arrange transportation now that the main road is partially cleared. We've also got a helicopter on standby if needed." The mention of a helicopter made Hank's eyebrows rise. This was far more than a simple traveling salesman or typical father on vacation. Victor caught Hank's surprised look and sighed. "I own a technology company," he admitted, "a fairly large one. We do advanced engineering work, some related to sustainability. I was taking Nathan to see my late father's old homestead. Guess we got more of an adventure than we bargained for." It was a moment of revelation. Hank had saved a corporate bigwig. Apparently, something inside Hank tensed. He'd always had a natural distrust of large corporations, especially of those that seemed indifferent to the struggles of small farmers. But the father and son he'd rescued didn't align with that stereotype of ruthless business magnates. "So you'll be heading out, then," Hank said quietly, trying to mask his conflicted feelings. Nathan's face fell. "But what about you, Mr. Foster?" the boy asked. "Don't you need help?" The child's earnestness struck Hank in the chest. Alicia's gaze flickered to the battered fields, the partially flooded yard. She whispered something to Victor. The father nodded thoughtfully. "We can't just leave without offering some assistance." "Hank," Victor said, "you saved our lives." Hank shifted uncomfortably, remembering how little he had left. "I appreciate that," he managed, "but you've got your own life to get back to. I'm just an old man with a farm that's seen better days." A pang of shame coursed through him, both for the state of his finances and for the foreignness of accepting help from near strangers. Yet he couldn't deny that an SUV full of high-powered individuals might hold resources far beyond his reach. Nathan spoke up again. Dad, maybe we can do something. He looked at Alicia as if seeking confirmation. The assistant nodded quietly. Hank felt a strange tension in the air, as though everyone was aware something big might happen next. But what exactly that was, he had no clue. He only knew that Buddy's barking had brought about a sudden shift in his quiet farm life. Where it would lead, he couldn't begin to guess. Later that night, after Alicia and the security detail had returned to town to secure lodging and coordinate with local officials, Victor, Nathan, and Hank found themselves back in the farmhouse's living room. A hush fell between them as the lantern flickered on the side table. Buddy lay dozing at Hank's feet, and the only sound was the drip of water off the eaves. Despite the commotion of the day, the farm now felt oddly peaceful, with the worst of the storm past. Nathan had fallen asleep on the couch, dinosaur toy tucked under his chin. Hank noticed the boy's steady breathing, a little rasp in the exhale, likely exhaustion from the ordeal. Across the room, Victor sipped a mug of lukewarm tea, his gaze drifting toward the window. I know it must feel like an intrusion, Victor said quietly, turning to Hank, but I couldn't just vanish without thanking you properly. And honestly, I'm concerned about your situation. You've been unbelievably kind to us. Hank shrugged, looking down at Buddy's soft fur. Wasn't anything special, he said, though he felt a twinge of defensiveness. I just did what needed doing. He paused, weighing his next words carefully. Part of him wanted to ask for help, financial help, irrigation solutions, anything. But pride was a difficult thing to overcome. I'm glad I was there at the right time, he added, letting his tone imply the rest. Victor nodded, setting the mug aside. Well, to me, it's more than nothing. You risked your life, your safety, to save us. And given the state of your fields, he hesitated. I suspect you could use assistance. My company, Vertex Technologies, works in sustainability and advanced resource management. We have projects that involve water conservation, soil reclamation, and such. Hank glanced up, intrigued despite himself. You do that kind of thing for farmland? Victor nodded. We partner with agricultural scientists, engineers. We've done pilot programs overseas, mostly, but there's no reason we couldn't do something here. Silence stretched between them, an unspoken question shimmering. Then Hank let out a breathy chuckle, shaking his head. You're talking about big corporate endeavors. Look at me, I'm a single old farmer with a few acres left that aren't submerged. The bank's about to foreclose. I wouldn't be a profitable investment. Victor leaned forward, his eyes holding a genuine softness. Not everything is about immediate profit. Sometimes it's about doing what's right, or demonstrating a model that might inspire others. Think of it as a showcase. If we can help an independent farm like yours bounce back after a disaster, it sends a strong message about sustainable farming's possibilities. Hank tried to process those words. It sounded almost too good to be true. Could a partnership with a tech firm salvage his ancestral land? Or would it just be a rebranding that stripped him of control? He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the moonlit puddles that dotted the yard. My folks, he began, voice tight. They worked this land through the Depression, the war years. They taught me that we stand on our own 2 feet, no matter what. I'm not opposed to help, mind you, but losing the farm's identity, that'd kill me as sure as anything. Victor rose carefully, mindful of his ankle. Then let's talk specifics, he offered. We're not here to take your farm. We want to see if there's a way to preserve it. We could bring in resources, new irrigation technology, maybe sponsor your next planting. Pausing, he looked at the sleeping Nathan, then back at Hank. We can figure out the details. But if you're open, I can have my team start drafting a proposal. At least consider it. Hank's heart pounded with conflicting emotions: hope, fear, pride, suspicion. He thought of the bank letters, the storm-ravaged fields, the decades of sweat and tears poured into that soil. Finally, he nodded slowly. I'll think about it, he said. And though his words were guarded, a flicker of possibility glimmered in his tired eyes. Payaku. The next morning brought a subdued hush over the farm. The sky was still overcast, but the rain had finally ceased. Puddles glistened in the early light. Hank rose at the dawn, a habit he could never break, and shuffled into the kitchen to put on a pot of coffee. To his mild surprise, Victor was already there, rummaging the cabinets for mugs. Didn't mean to snoop, Victor said sheepishly. Just needed a bit of caffeine. Hank chuckled and waved off the apology. Help yourself. Hard enough finding anything in my own kitchen these days. Nathan, still drowsy, joined them a few minutes later, lured by the smell of toast. Over a simple breakfast of eggs and stale bread softened with jam, they planned the day. Alicia had called Victor's phone early. Apparently cell service was still patchy, but improving. The roads to the nearby town were partially open. She was coordinating with local officials, hoping to send a suitable vehicle or helicopter for a pickup. Hank tried not to dwell on the strangeness of helicopter rides and corporate assistance in his quiet corner of Georgia. His focus remained on the battered fields beyond the window. After breakfast, Hank let Buddy out for a run, then grabbed a stack of outdated receipts and bank statements from the kitchen drawer. He settled at the table to review his finances, a chore he'd been dreading. He felt Victor's presence loom at the opposite side of the table. What are you looking at? The younger man asked gently. Hank sighed, flipping through the papers. Just trying to see how bad it is. He paused, eyeing the numbers. I owe the bank a payment in a couple of weeks, the biggest I've ever had to make, and I just lost the majority of my cash crop. Victor nodded, glancing at the columns of figures. He cleared his throat, looking hesitant. Would you be willing to let me see some of this in detail? I might be able to. He caught himself. I mean, at least help you reorganize the info. See if there's a path forward. Hank hesitated, the old protective pride flaring up. But something in Victor's earnest expression nudged him to relent. All right, he said slowly, sliding the pile across. Can't see the harm. So, while Nathan busied himself petting Buddy on the porch, Hank and Victor spent the better part of an hour combing through the finances. Hank explained each line item: fertilizer costs, seed purchases, minor equipment repairs that added up, property taxes, mortgage interest. Victor listened carefully, occasionally jotting notes in the margin. His brow knitted when he saw the ballooning interest rates from the bank. These rates are pretty steep, Victor commented. That's the norm around here, Hank replied with a hint of bitterness. Small farms aren't exactly top-tier clients these days. By late morning, they'd formed a rough picture. Hank's mortgage had been refinanced multiple times. Each deferral dug him deeper. On top of that were operational expenses that soared whenever unpredictable storms, droughts, or pests hit. Victor rubbed his temples. I see now why you were reluctant about outside help, he remarked. Feels like a bottomless pit. Hank offered a wry smile. Welcome to small-scale farming in the modern age. The family name might have once meant something around here, but not anymore. Not to the bank. At least. Victor's phone buzzed with a text. Alicia, presumably with news on the rescue plan. Before checking it, he turned to Hank. If you agree, I'd like to have a few of my people come here for an assessment. Soil scientists, irrigation experts. We can see what can be salvaged, how quickly, and how cost-effectively. Then we can decide if the partnership idea is viable. Hank stared at the soggy farmland outside, remembering all the times he tried to patch together solutions alone. Finally, he sighed. All right, he said. Let's see what you've got. But I'll warn you, this farm may be too far gone. Victor met his gaze. I have faith it's not. If a man like you can brave a flood to save a stranger, maybe we can muster the same courage to save this land. Early that afternoon, the rumble of an approaching vehicle announced Alicia's return. This time, she wasn't alone. A second SUV followed behind, and when the convoy stopped in Hank's muddy driveway, a small group of people emerged, 2 men and 2 women, each dressed in rugged field attire but carrying sleek equipment cases. Alicia introduced them as part of Victor's special projects team, an agronomist named Dr. Carlson, an irrigation engineer named Melody, a soil specialist called Irene, and a financial analyst named Jorge. Hank's eyebrows rose at the scale of it. But Victor explained, "We can do a preliminary assessment in a single sweep this way." Hank found himself in a flurry of activity he barely recognized. Irene walked the fields with a sampling kit, scooping soil into little plastic containers and labeling them meticulously. Dr. Carlson took photos of the damaged crops, muttering about nutrient depletion and erosion levels. Melody inspected the battered irrigation lines, occasionally shaking her head at their outdated state. Meanwhile, Jorge hovered near Hank, asking detailed questions about yield history and markets. Tapping data into a tablet, Buddy, initially confused by the swarm of newcomers, trailed behind them, wagging his tail. Nathan watched with fascination, sometimes pointing out areas still submerged in water. Victor stayed close to Hank, offering a quiet presence as the older man tried to wrap his mind around what was happening. It felt surreal to see such a professional operation in his fields, as if a mini corporate expedition had landed in rural Georgia. By the time they reconvened on the porch near sunset, the group had pages of notes and digital records. Alicia distributed bottled water in ironic gesture. Hank thought, given the farmland's flooding, once everyone was settled, Carlson spoke first. The good news is that the top layer of soil, while eroded, is not beyond remediation. You'll need major amendments in grading to prevent future runoff. Though, Irene nodded, and the subsoil seems intact in most places, meaning you haven't lost the foundational layers. That's promising, but it'll cost money and labor to restore. Melody chimed in about water management. The old irrigation system can't be salvaged. Let's be honest, we'd need a modern drip system or micro sprinklers. For that, we'll need stable water pressure, a reservoir or well upgrade, and some advanced filtration. Jorge then turned to Hank with a gentle expression. Financially, it's going to be an investment that a small farm typically wouldn't handle alone, but under a partnership arrangement, you wouldn't bear the brunt by yourself. Hank's head spun as he tried to absorb their findings. The big question, of course, was how exactly this partnership would work. So he asked. Victor cleared his throat and stood, placing a hand on Nathan's shoulder briefly. "Here's what I propose," Victor began. "We form a legal agreement where you remain the sole owner of Foster Farm. Vertex Technologies supplies the capital and expertise to rehabilitate and modernize the field's irrigation, soil reclamation, maybe even a small pilot greenhouse. In return, we get to use your farm as a demonstration site for sustainable small-scale agriculture. We'll bring media attention to it, show how technology can revive and sustain family farms. Any revenue from increased yield or tours, we split fairly." Hank's gaze dropped to the floor. A swirl of emotions coursed through him, relief at a possible lifeline, fear of losing tradition, skepticism about corporate motives. He recalled the old lessons from his father: never trust quick fixes. But something about Victor's sincerity, combined with the thoroughness of the team, made Hank hesitate to dismiss them. If this partnership could truly save his land, was it worth putting aside old suspicions? Finally, Hank looked up, scanning the faces of these strangers who suddenly felt less strange. "Let me sleep on it," he said quietly. "This ain't a decision I can make lightly." Alicia nodded. "Of course. Mr. Foster, take your time. We'll be around if you have questions." The group began packing up, heading back to their SUVs. Hank noticed that Nathan had drifted to the edge of the porch, gazing wistfully at the horizon. Buddy padded up to the boy, tail wagging. The child bent down and petted the dog, whispering something Hank couldn't hear. Hank realized that for Nathan, this farm might be taking on a magical quality, the place where he and his father had been rescued. What might it mean for him to see it reborn? Hank swallowed, letting that thought settle. Perhaps, just perhaps, redemption was possible for both man and land. Night fell again over the Foster farm, this time with clearer skies and a sliver of moonlight illuminating the battered fields. The wind had gentled to a mild breeze. Inside the farmhouse, a subdued tension lingered, like the calm after the storm, but before the next big decision. Hank brewed one last pot of coffee, setting 2 mugs on the worn kitchen table. Figured we could both use some, he said to Victor, who nodded gratefully. Nathan was asleep again, curled on the couch with Buddy at his feet. They sipped the coffee in silence for a few moments, neither man quite sure how to broach the looming question. Finally, Hank cleared his throat. You realize this is bigger than just me letting you pay for some repairs, right? He gestured at the dark windows. You'd be changing the very nature of this farm. My father never used computerized drip lines or climate sensors. He believed in the old ways. I'm not sure how he'd feel about all this high-tech involvement. Victor folded his hands around the warm mug. I understand. Tradition is important. My dad grew up on a farm, too, albeit in a different part of the state. He used to say that you have to respect the land, not just exploit it. He paused, collecting his thoughts. Look, I'm not suggesting we turn your farm into some plastic corporate showpiece. The whole point is to honor what you do here, grow real food in a sustainable, family-run way, and then enhance it with some modern methods that ensure it can continue in the face of unpredictable weather and market pressures. Hank scratched the stubble on his chin. I want to keep the name Foster Farm, he said softly, and I won't have suits telling me what to plant every season. Victor inclined his head. The name stays, and you decide what goes in the ground. We'd make recommendations on water usage and soil management. Sure, but ultimately, you'd maintain control. Hank let out a slow breath, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. You said you'd put up the capital. I can't promise you'll get it back. Farming is never a sure thing. Victor smiled ruefully. I've learned from you that sure things aren't always what matter. Sometimes you take a risk because it's the right thing to do. They fell silent once more, sipping the last of the coffee. Outside, a lone owl hooted. The farm, though scarred by the storm, held a quiet dignity under the moonlight. Hank thought about how close he'd come to losing everything his livelihood, the legacy left by his parents and grandparents. He also thought about how it felt to save Victor and Nathan, a spur-of-the-moment decision that had already changed the course of events. Finally, he looked Victor in the eyes. I'll give it a shot, he said, voice steady. On one condition, we do it right, with respect for the land, respect for the people who came before. And we keep a place at the table for my family, my kids might want to say. Victor nodded solemnly. Deal, he replied, extending his hand across the table. They shook, sealing something that felt far more significant than a mere contract and act of faith in each other's intentions. When they parted for the night, Hank lingered in the kitchen, mind too busy for sleep. He placed the mugs in the sink and glanced at the faint reflection of himself in the window. 68 years old, battered by storms inside and out, yet standing on the brink of a new horizon. He remembered Laura's voice telling him, don't be afraid to change if it means surviving. Hank, a farm must evolve or perish. Quietly, he whispered, guess you were right again, Laura, and allowed a small, hopeful smile. Tomorrow, he'd face the dawn not as the man who was about to lose everything, but as the one ready to rebuild. The next day, an early summer sun broke through the clouds, bathing Foster Farm in golden light. Hank stepped onto his porch, inhaling air that still held the scent of damp earth, but carried the promise of renewal. The farmlands stretched before him, wounded but not defeated. Slowly, the remains of the floods would drain away, and the soil would settle, ready, or so he prayed, for a new chapter. By mid-morning, Alicia arrived with papers for Hank to review, along with a timeline for the initial improvements. Melancholy flickered through him as he signed the preliminary agreement, imagining his father's calloused hands over his own. But he also felt a spark of anticipation, remembering Victor's words about building something that merged the best of tradition with the best of innovation. Melody and Dr. Carlson reappeared, measuring sections of the field where new irrigation lines would be laid. Irene scheduled shipments of soil amendments. Jorge, the financial analyst, typed away on his tablet, discussing potential microloan structures that would let Hank maintain ultimate ownership. All the while, Victor stood nearby, walking gingerly on his still sore ankle, occasionally lifting Nathan so the boy could see the agronomists at work. Nathan's excitement was palpable. He peppered everyone with questions about the sensors, the pipes, the seeds. Hank found himself grinning. This child's wonder reminded him of his own younger days, when everything about farming felt miraculous. A week later, once the roads dried enough, Hank's daughter and son came to visit. Hearing the news, they were astonished by the sudden presence of a corporate team on their childhood farm. Initially, they seemed worried Hank had sold off the property, but he reassured them that was not the case. He explained the partnership, how it might save Foster Farm. As they toured the muddy fields together, the weight of the previous generation's worry lifted. Perhaps their father wouldn't have to fight the bank alone after all. In the weeks that followed, earth movers arrived to reshape the worst eroded sections. Drainage channels were dug properly, and newly installed micro-sprinklers gleamed under the sunlight. Even the battered tractor got an overhaul courtesy of an experimental program that helped retrofit older machinery with more efficient engines. Hank spent his days learning from Melody's demonstration sessions. She showed him how to operate a digital control panel for the drip system, how to read real-time soil moisture data from a simple phone app. It felt surreal at first, but he found it oddly exhilarating to have precise insight into his land's needs. As July rolled in, Hank planted a fresh crop of beans, collard greens, and tomatoes, each row meticulously calibrated for optimal water usage. Media outlets began calling, intrigued by the small farm revival story, but Hank politely declined any big interviews, preferring to wait until he had something tangible to show. Still, the knowledge that the world was watching made him stand a little taller. He was a living testament that sometimes survival meant adapting. The day came when the first new sprouts poked their leaves above the soil. Hank knelt, gently brushing dirt aside to reveal the tender, green shoots. Nathan was at his side, eyes glowing with excitement. "They're growing," the boy exclaimed, turning to Hank. "They are," Hank agreed, voice thick with emotion. "And so are we." He recalled the moment he plucked Nathan from that submerged SUV, never imagining how the act of saving a boy's life would, in turn, save the farm he loved. As the sun set behind the distant pines, Hank stood with Victor and Nathan by the new irrigation lines, watching the gentle spray of water arc across the land. Buddy trotted among the rows, chasing grasshoppers. It wasn't the same farm Hank had known all his life. It was a farm transformed, living proof that tradition and innovation could coexist. And in Hank's heart, he felt Laura's presence, smiling approval from wherever she rested. "Well," he said quietly, "there's a new day coming for Foster Farm." Beside him, Victor and Nathan nodded, the father holding the son's hand, gratitude shining in their eyes. The final rays of sunlight caught the droplets of water, turning them into tiny rainbows. With that, hope for a renewed future glowed across the farmland, a bright promise against the fading sky. Looking back on everything that happened, the flood, the rescue, and the unlikely partnership, what stands out most is the power of compassion. Hank's willingness to help strangers in peril opened the door to rejuvenating a century-old farm, proving that the best traditions can flourish when joined with forward-thinking innovation. Today, the Foster property is thriving once again, a beacon of hope for anyone who's felt the squeeze of hard times. In my own view, this story isn't just about crops or business deals, it's about community, resilience, and the surprising ways that kindness returns to us. If you were moved by Hank's journey, please share your thoughts in the comments. Let's discuss what we can learn from his courage, and remember to hit subscribe for more inspiring stories.